In section 3, we'll look at the process of bone formation, which is also called ossification. Now here you see two terms associated with ossification, two different types. The first one is intramembranous. That just means that for this process to take place, you have to have some type of connective tissue in place that the bone is going to form around. You have a connective tissue membrane that the bone is formed around, such as what takes place in the skull and the development of the skull bones. Endochondral ossification pretty much takes place in the rest of the skeleton, and this is where you start out with a cartilage, like a cartilage model, and then you have the bone matrix laid on top of that cartilage model, or replacing that cartilage model, and that's endochondral ossification. By the way, this root word chondra here refers to cartilage, so anytime you see chondra or a form of that, it's going to have something to do with cartilage. Now, early type of bone that you first start out with, whether you're talking about fetal development or if you're talking about new bone that forms whenever you break a bone and have to replace bone tissue, then that's referred to as woven bone. That's because the collagen fibers that are associated with woven bone are randomly oriented. They look like they're just kind of woven together, kind of seen like in the picture of the microscope image there. So early bone, new bone is referred to as woven bone, but that gets reprocessed and reabsorbed and replaced with something called lamellar bone. Lamellar bone is named because the bone matrix and the bone fibers are oriented in sheets, layered sheets called lamellae. The fibers pretty much run in the same direction, but what happens is you have alternating patterns kind of at 90-degree angles kind of throughout, and it helps to strengthen the bone matrix to have it in a alternating pattern like this. And so lamellar bone, again, this is your adult type bone. This is your mature, stronger type of a bone. Woven bone is what you form during fetal development, or if you break a bone and have to replace some bone tissue. Now let's look at intramembranous ossification. Just a couple of words here, vocabulary words that are associated with this process, making bone using a tissue membrane to begin with. You start out with what's called a primary ossification center. This is where bone formation begins. It's got to begin somewhere, and so the process of bone formation begins at the primary ossification center. You may be familiar with the word fontanelle. This is large membrane spaces that develop in between the skull bones. So whenever the skull is developing in a developing baby, in an unborn baby, the skull bones begin to develop in the process called intramembranous ossification. And then there's a membrane that kind of separates those bones up until usually the baby is like 2 years old before those bones completely ossify and grow together. So you're left with membranes that are unossified. We generally call these soft spots, and so I'll show you a picture of those. This picture kind of shows, this figure shows some of those areas. This is a 12-week-old developing baby, and you see a ossification center. This is where bone formation is taking place. The membrane is where you have a connective tissue membrane, is where the bone matrix is being kind of laid down onto. And then it's starting to develop some of the bones of the skull. And in the meantime, you have some exposed membrane area. And so these are areas of fontanelles that are exposed membrane that don't have bone tissue ossified yet. Now, the second main type of ossification is endochondral. Remember, this means cartilage, and so it takes place within cartilage. You basically start out with a cartilage type model, and I'll show you a figure with this as well. This happens in the bones at the base of the skull and pretty much everywhere else in the skeletal system. You start forming cartilage at the end of the 4th week of prenatal development, and then the process of bone formation, ossification, begins at the 8th week. And so figure 6.12 kind of goes through the steps of endochondral ossification. Again, you start out with some kind of cartilage that you're going to start building the bone matrix around. And so this cartilage model is made out of hyaline cartilage. It still has a perichondrium, a layer around it. That perichondrium actually has chondrocytes. So again, Anytime you see the prefix of the word chondra here, that refers to cartilage. So chondrocyte is a cartilage cell. You have chondroblast. These are cells that help to make cartilage. And so what happens in endochondral ossification is that the chondroblasts begin to turn into osteoblasts. And so now these have differentiated or developed into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the cells that are going to start making the bone matrix. And so it begins usually in the middle section of that cartilage model. Will start making the osteoblasts will start making the matrix, and will start secreting the matrix outside and outside of those cells into the bone area here to replace the cartilage that's there. That process continues, and it starts forming a new bone matrix throughout that cartilage model, and eventually to the point where you have a hardened bone. It starts out again with the woven type bone, and eventually it gets replaced with that lamellar type compact bone around the edges and to the ends of the bone. Now, there are a few places that remain cartilage. So, for example, you still have a little bit of cartilage on the outside of the edge of the bone. That's called articular cartilage. And then you'll still have what's called a growth plate or epiphyseal plate that remains cartilage until usually after puberty, when that epiphyseal growth plate actually hardens and ossifies. But while you're still growing, while your bones are still growing and getting larger, then you have this epiphyseal plate here that contains actively growing cartilage and bone cells. So that kind of leads us in talking about bone growth. There's actually two types of bone growth, longitudinal growth and appositional growth. So we need to kind of define and kind of talk about these two types of growth. The longitudinal growth is what it sounds like. The bones are growing in length or getting longer. And this takes place at that epiphyseal plate, because this is where you have tissue that has not ossified yet, hasn't turned into bone yet. And so if you take a look at the diagram, you see the end of a long bone. They label this a humerus. At the end of the long bone, you see the epiphyseal plate, that's cartilage cells. They take a section out of it, and you kind of see different zones that are associated with the epiphyseal plate. The first zone, the lower zone here, is what's called the zone of proliferation. It just means that these cells are actively growing, actively dividing. This is where those cartilage cells are at. These are chondrocytes, and they're actively going through mitosis and going through division. Then you have another layer, another zone called zone of hypertrophy and maturation. This is where those chondrocytes, notice that they're getting bigger. That's what hypertrophy means. The cells are growing larger. They're not dividing as much now. They're just growing larger in size. Then the third zone is zone of calcification. These chondrocytes are starting to die off, and they're starting to deposit calcium inside of this matrix region. Then you have the last zone is the zone of ossification. This zone is where now you have the osteocytes, the osteoblasts that are there, and they've deposited bone matrix around the bone cells. So this is where the cartilage is no longer there. It's now started to form true bone, or the ossification process is now complete. The other type of bone growth is appositional growth, and this only takes place on the surface of the bones. It's not going to cause the bone to grow in length, but it takes place on the surface of bones, either on old bones or on cartilage, and that's because that the outer layer, that periosteum we mentioned earlier, that outer cellular layer has osteoblasts there, and it's the osteoblasts that build up new bone matrix on the outside of the bone.